So, in what ways do you think the Aberdeen economy differs from the rest of Scotland?
I think the Aberdeen economy is in some ways much more insulated than the rest of Scotland because it is, for example, if we look back at what happened after the financial crash, the property bubble in Aberdeen didn't burst in the way that it burst in many places in Scotland or in the rest of the UK, in fact. It stayed kind of pretty buoyant during that period. But in other ways, it's much more exposed because it's so heavily reliant on the oil industry and on the fate of the oil price. If the oil price goes up, things are more buoyant here. If the oil price goes down, things struggle a bit here. We saw that with the redundancies that there were when the oil price crashed. So in some ways, as I say, it's much more insulated, but in some ways it's much more exposed because there is not the kind of diversity in the economy that we need to see in a city like Aberdeen in order for it to be successful, even if there is some kind of economic shock that happens.
Recently you said that Brexit poses a £2 billion risk to the North East. Can you maybe take some talk about some of the ways Brexit will affect Aberdeen and the North East? What about its impact on employment?
I think for the North East, which is a place that has historically really struggled to attract people like teachers and nurses and public sector workers to come and live and work in Aberdeen because of that high property price that there's been because of the oil industry. I think for me, it feels like the biggest impact will be the impact of immigration. If we cannot have people being encouraged to come and live and work in Scotland, then we will really struggle to get those public sector workers. And who's going to want to come and live in Aberdeen if we can't attract teachers to come and work in our schools, if we can't attract nurses to be in our hospital, if we don't have those high standards of public services, then we're really going to struggle, and it becomes this really bad cycle where we end up making things worse and worse because of our inability to attract immigration. But outside immigration, the other thing is that even though the oil and gas industry is a global industry, it is the case that we are heavily reliant on trade with the EU. We're heavily reliant, if you look at the harbour and the trade that the harbour does, for example, huge percentage of that is with EU countries. Ships are leaving Aberdeen or coming to Aberdeen from the EU. And if we end up having barriers to that trade and making things more difficult, then that's a really big problem. And just lastly, in relation to the strengths of the North East, the other thing that we are absolutely brilliant at is farming. We are very, very good at producing excellent food, whether that's from farms or whether that's from the sea. And we need to be able to trade with that. We need to be able to sell that to Europe. People are not going to buy fresh fish in America from the North Sea because it's not going to be fresh by the time it gets to America. So we need those trade flows to continue, and I think that Brexit, and particularly a no-deal Brexit, really causes a big problem for the ease of those trade flows and therefore impacts really directly on the economy in the North East.
For Aberdonians living and working, there is a lot of concern of an economic decline. How can we reassure people that they will have stability and protection in such uncertain times?
I think it's really difficult for us just now to say, yes, everything's going to be fine, because the reality is that we don't have control of this. The reality is that the people of Scotland do not have the ability to choose their form of governance just now, or their own government just now, because we can choose the Scottish government, but they don't have all of the levers that they need to have. So for me to sit here and say everything's going to be fine, when Scotland doesn't control its own immigration system, when Scotland doesn't control its own tax system, when the Scottish government cannot move flexibly because it doesn't have the economic levers in order to encourage business investment and growth, it's very difficult for me to say everything will be fine. I can't do that at this moment in time. What I can say is that if Scotland becomes an independent country, when we are that independent country, then the government of Scotland will work for the benefit of people in Scotland, rather than having the government of the UK working for the benefit of not Scotland, of people other than the folk that live here.
As an oil-dependent city, Aberdeen, the impact of transitioning to renewables will be more significant than many other areas. Can you talk about how a just transition will allow the balance between offering stability for people of Aberdeen and meeting our ecological commitments?
It does really concern me that the transition from oil and gas to a kind of renewable future has not been as well thought out, as well organised, as well sorted as it should have been. I mean, the UK government, who've got the control over these things, control over oil and gas tax, the control over renewable obligations and contracts for difference, and basically the way that renewables are funded, have not planned the future. They have not. We saw that with the carbon capture and storage plant that there was supposed to be in the northeast of Scotland. The UK government, George Osborne, pulled the rug out from under that with absolutely no warning. So there has not been this long-term planning that there should have been. The Scottish Government has done everything that it can in this space and is doing brilliantly about encouraging renewables and discouraging carbon-intensive industries and making the case for Scotland to be a net zero economy much more quickly than the UK is. But the reality is, again, we do not have all of the levers here. We do not have all of the power in this space. So it does concern me that this may not happen right. Now, we are at this tipping point and we actually have a really good opportunity here because politicians are now talking and thinking about a low carbon future in a way that they have never done before. People, the general public, have done it, some of them, but now there's this real movement behind it. And I think we're at this real position where people can come together, where politicians can come together and say, we want a low carbon future, this is how we will achieve it. And it's not about saying to people in Aberdeen, right, you'll all be made redundant, because that's not the future for Aberdeen. The future for Aberdeen is to use those amazing skills that we have in subsea technology, for example, in the technology that we use in the oil and gas industry, working in those really difficult environments, and to repurpose those technologies and to use them to do carbon capture and storage, to use them to do offshore wind platforms, to use them to do tidal and wave energy, to use them to do all of these things that are low carbon futures rather than carbon intensive futures. The reality is that we will still be taking oil and gas out of the North Sea for some time into the future. Those jobs will still be there for some time into the future, but we need to plan now for a future without oil and gas so that we can move to that future as quickly as possible.
This was kind of touched upon in the last question, but in what ways will the UK economic strategy prevent us from creating this transition in the best way we can?
I think the UK have, if you look at the fact that the UK government has had so many ministers for oil and gas and for climate change over the past number of years, it feels to me like even in my time in Parliament, every time that you get a new minister, you've got to teach them about how oil and gas works. And just as you've managed to teach them how oil and gas works, they're gone and we've got a new one that you've got to teach about how oil and gas works. And it's exactly the same around climate change. People do not have a grip of the issues around climate change. So, in an independent Scotland, the Scottish Government would be saying, this is the most important thing. We need to make a transition to a low carbon future, to a future where actually Scotland can be not just carbon neutral, but can be having a negative carbon balance, if you like, can be taking carbon from other places and storing it in our carbon capture system. So the fact that our government would do that, the fact that the UK government is unwilling to do that. If you look at things like the onshore wind, for example, we've got huge capacity to have onshore wind in Scotland, but because of the Conservative government, because of the fact that they've said, sorry, England doesn't want more onshore wind, we haven't got it. So, the decisions that are being made in England for the benefit of England don't make sense in Scotland, and we need a government that will have all of the powers and all of the ability to make those decisions itself.
So this is the last question. What benefits can Aberdeen hope to gain from independence that you think can be provided by the UK more generally?
I think the UK government has focused, whatever colour of government it's been, on trying to win the next election. They have not focused on trying to do the best thing for either the people of the UK, certainly not for the people of Scotland. And if the government are making decisions to try and win the next election, to try and please those people that vote, rather than to try and do the best thing in the future of the country, you're not ever going to have Aberdeen being prioritised because we certainly don't figure in the kind of minds of the politicians that there are in Westminster. And no matter how much I am shouting for Aberdeen, or previous MPs who've represented the city are shouting for Aberdeen, the reality is that we are not the economic centre of the UK, and so politicians in Westminster are not going to do the best thing that they can for Aberdeen. But in Scotland, Aberdeen is hugely more important. The oil industry is hugely more important. The future of that oil industry is hugely more important than it is for the UK as a whole. So if you have a government that prioritises Aberdeen and that makes sure that we have access to the services, that we've got access to the best immigration policies, so that we've got people coming to live and work here and support our public services, that we've got, if you look at the AWPR that has been built, that would not have happened had we not had a government that was prioritising the needs and wants and requirements of people in and around Aberdeen. And I think the last thing that's really, really important for me is the fact that a government of a smaller country can move much more quickly and much more flexibly to make the changes that need to be made. So when we saw the massive issues when there was the oil and gas price crash back in around 2015, 2016, the Scottish Government would have moved to fix that so much more quickly, or to mitigate the effects of that so much more quickly than the UK government did, who sort of said, this doesn't matter, let's just ignore it for a while and hope it goes away. And it didn't go away. Aberdeen needed that help. The Scottish Government would have done that so much more quickly if we'd had the levers to do that, and we weren't able to. So I think that Aberdeen would benefit hugely because its uniqueness would be recognised, and that flexible approach to the city would happen in a way that it can't happen as part of the UK.